Hi, my name's Arthur, and today I want to talk about something that I think some of my viewers might find surprising, which is that there are some trans men who aren't comfortable being men. So I guess I want to talk about why I get that sense, and then talk about some advice for people in those positions, because I once was a trans man who didn't really feel comfortable being a man, and now, well, I am a man, and I love it. I exist in a lot of trans spaces. I am transgender, and so I have transgender friends. I go to parties with trans people, I go to the club with trans people, I go on long walks with trans people, I hang out in trans spaces. I also am, as you can tell, a trans content creator. And so I follow other trans content creators on TikTok, on YouTube, I subscribe to various transgender subreddits. So I feel like I get a broad sense, holistically, about how our community will talk about certain issues. And so many of you are, I assume, familiar with the various sort of slogans of trans women are women, and then sometimes followed with trans men are men. So it was interesting to see recently that people were talking about how the specifically trans men are men part reduces the idea of trans men's manhood into something narrow and implies that trans men are always men like cis men. And that's bad because some trans men have a sort of idea of gender that's much more expansive than cis men. And I heard that rhetoric and that sort of discussion specifically about the trans men are men part, which is unsurprising to me because of how I hear our community talk about men generally. I think that it's often seen as sort of inherently bad to be a man, and that the way that we talk about men, and often, again, cis men, putting distance between ourselves and cis men, is as if cis men are like this horrible, evil entity. And so it's unsurprising that we would want to distance ourselves from cis men and say, no, trans men are often men in a way that's totally different from evil, scary cis men. And I see this not just online, but I see this in real life, too. Like, I'll have friends that will be like, oh, isn't that club just a cis-gay club? And I'm like, no, it's a club that men go to, and I fit in there. I am not cis. I am gay. It's a gay male club. Or I had one friend that was like, I was talking with this person about how I am not often out as trans. Like, many people don't realize it, and I often don't feel the need to tell them, and so in work and professional contexts, I'm often somewhat stealth about my transness and private about it. And they were like, wow, that's so interesting. So you feel like a man in the same way that a cis man feels like a man. And they were like really earnest about it, but it was just surprising to them. Like, the idea that a trans man could just fully transition and just feel like a man is something that I think our community really doesn't talk about a lot, or that some people view as sort of surprising. And so, yeah, what's the answer? Yeah, I feel like a man. I mean, I am trans, but that's just one sort of attribute about my manhood. I'm also short, I am also a grad student, I am also extroverted, I have all sorts of little adjectives you could stack on the word man. You could say trans man, you could say extroverted man, whatever. But, you know, I think the further and further I get into my transition, I just don't feel that different than a cis man. And at one point I did, and at one point it was sort of a scary idea to be a man, because the vision I had of men was pretty scary. And so, I guess I wanted to talk about how I think sometimes, for some trans men, that it's useful to confront those fears head on. The fears about what it would be like for you to really become a man, rather than trying to put distance between yourself and cis men. And that putting distance between trans men and cis men really might not fix this problem that we have as a community of being scared of men as men ourselves. And so I guess I want to be clear that I know that there are some people for whom, when they say this, when they're like, oh, I don't feel like a man in the same way the cis man feels like a man, maybe it's not coming from a place of fear. It's really earnest, it's very genuine. Maybe they're also non-binary or also genderqueer, right? So you have these sort of genderqueer trans men who feel an attachment to the word man and feel like men, but in a fundamentally different way. Their transness is really intrinsic to their experience of gender, and they feel like just really different. And I totally get that that kind of person exists. And for that kind of person, maybe this distance feels like a really nice form of representation, right? You hear people talking about, no, you can, be a trans man and not, not exist in the world in all the ways that cis men exist, and that feels like really nice to hear that. And so I'm not like that, so I can't claim that for those people this isn't a really helpful way to frame it, and that this isn't a really helpful way to talk about it. Yeah, maybe it is, and if you're that kind of person, totally. But I guess that I see often another kind of trans man, or another kind of transmasculine person, which is the kind of person that really feels super, super drawn to wanting to be male, right? They imagine themselves with all sorts of male physical attributes. Because they can imagine that. They can imagine what it would be like to have a flat chest. What would it be like to have a deep voice? What would it be like to have a beard? To walk down the street and to be seen as sort of like a masculine person. And they know they want that. They want their body to be really male. They know it excites them, they're clear about that. But it's much harder to imagine what would it be like to exist fully in society as a man. They can imagine their body changing, but they can't really imagine their position changing. And why is that? Well, because cis men have been horrible to them for like a lot of their lives. cis men have bullied them, maybe about their queerness, maybe about their gender, and they've had a hard time making friends with cis men. Maybe most of their friends are women. Maybe they've existed in spaces, like lesbian spaces, that have really centered a sort of female experience and really talk negatively about men. And so it feels like kind of horrifying to imagine becoming something that has not treated people well, right? And so they have a lot of like natural fears. And so instead, they can comprehend the body changes they want, can't really comprehend the social changes they want, and so in response, try to separate their vision of their gender from cis men in response to that fear. And so maybe that looks like imagining that they want to become a boy rather than become a man, right? A softer version. Maybe that means sort of thinking about these identities like being a non-binary trans man or genderqueer trans man or transmasculine, not necessarily because they're drawn to those identities, but because of fear of the word man. So pushed away from man rather than pulled towards those identities. And I think for that kind of person, there are lots of ways where sort of really proactively you can embrace that fear and work through those feelings, and that in the end, you might end up in a really like wonderful spot. And so, I don't know, let's talk about me. When I was earlier in my transition, and so I had, cut my hair and I was dressing really masculinely, and I wasn't yet on T, I didn't feel comfortable identifying as a man. That felt ridiculous to me. I didn't pass as a man when I did pass. I passed as a little boy. So, like, who was I as this little boy-looking creature to say, oh, well, I'm a man? And when I thought about the world where I looked like a man, I wasn't sure what it would feel like to be a man. And so I remember literally writing in my gender journal, I think I actually have a quote of me reading it on this channel, that I thought, oh, maybe when I'm done transitioning, I'll identify as a genderqueer trans man. And I didn't spend a lot of time trying to think through what identity labels would eventually speak to me after I medically transitioned, because it just all felt hypothetical. Like, I couldn't imagine what it would be like to exist in, the social role of being a man, and so I just sort of was setting it aside, and I was like, once I'm further along in T, I will think about that. Later on, I will think about that. And that's something that I think is understated. People talk about social transition like it's just changing your pronouns and asking someone to call you a new name. I think social transition is way more intense than that. It's not just one step. I felt like I socially transitioned at every sort of stage of the process. When I cut off my hair and I went from looking like a feminine woman to sort of very androgynous, I got treated so differently. I remember that I was doing this summer internship and people treated me as masculine, and maybe I was getting read sort of as female, but I would play soccer shirtless in a sports bra. I would hang out late at night playing Catan with other guys. Like, I felt really like I was treated masculinely, and that was really new for me. And then I remember I'd return to campus again, sort of passing quite androgynously, sometimes as a young boy, sometimes as a very effeminate gay man, sometimes as a butch woman. And I remember getting called the F slur when I was walking down the street. I remember that my partner and I now felt scared to hold hands, and it was so clear that how I was being treated was changing each step of the way. And getting adjusted to how I was being treated, that was part of my social transition. And so when I started this YouTube channel, I was like 8 or 9 months on T, and I look at old images of myself then. I mean, you can watch that old video, and yeah, I look like I was earlier on T. My face is rounder. There are all sorts of physical changes that came my way later on. But I was being read as a man. But I wasn't comfortable being a man then. I hadn't socially transitioned into that place of feeling totally comfortable with it. You'll notice in that video that I call myself a dude, and I call myself a guy, and I call myself a trans man. But I never used the word man on its own. I never said, oh, now that I'm a man. Because I didn't yet feel that way. I didn't feel fully comfortable with that. I also talk about how I felt nervous going into men's bathrooms. Again, if you look at me there, fully passing. I've been passing for months, but I was still nervous about it. So that fear takes time to go. And your social transition part of it is feeling comfortable with the fact that people will treat you like a man when you start looking like a man. And so how did I get to that place? How did I go from feeling at one point sort of not very comfortable with being seen as a man and that making me anxious and feeling uncertain about it all to now feeling incredibly comfortable being a man? I think it was because I felt able to confront these fears head on. Okay, so to start, just imagine a cis man. I want you to really imagine every detail about him. Like, what does he look like? What does the cis guy, act like, sound like? And then imagine hanging out with him. Like, what would you do with him? I think that for many of us, when we hear cis man, we have this image of a broad football player who's white and has brown hair slicked back, sort of the all-American masculinity. That's what we hear when we say cis man. And we imagine hanging out with him and we're like, well, I don't know sports. I don't know what I would say to him. I can't interact with him. And let me tell you, I'm very comfortable being a man, and I still am not comfortable hanging out with that kind of sort of all-American masculinity. I mean, whatever, I can hang out with that kind of person, but I'm never going to be best friends with that. I don't know sports, I don't care for sports. It's fine, it's cool, it's just not my thing. And now it doesn't feel any deeper than that, because that's only one kind of man. It's very clear to me, right? I went and I got my haircut last week, and the barber's there, like sort of this rugged type of masculinity, and he gave me this handshake at the end, and I didn't know what I was doing. And it's like, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing. And I talk with my friends who are, cis men and who are often effeminate or gay or whatever, and they all don't know what they're doing at the barbers. It doesn't matter. That's like a very particular type of masculinity that I think we center as like what we imagine cis men are. And so of course it's scary, and of course then we feel like, oh, I could never be a man like a cis man is a man because you don't think you're going to be a football player. And I know it sounds like, I imagine for many of you guys, you're like, okay, obviously I had a more broad view than that, and obviously that isn't what's going on. But I think that sometimes, if you take a long time to introspect and unpack it, it is kind of what was going on, and it was for me at least. And I guess, like, let me describe one of my friends, right? So, he is very tall and thin and quiet, and he has, like, his voice is sort of high-pitched, so many people think he's gay, but he actually is straight and has a very long-term girlfriend, and they're very in love. He loves nice sweaters, he loves to play board games, he loves quiet nights in with friends. That's not sort of that, like, a cis man that we imagine. But he is a cis man. And he's my kind of man, right? Like, he's the kind of guy I hang out with. And I think that once we start fitting in as men, we start to see, oh wow, there are a lot of men out there, and some of those men are going to be our kind of man. And many of those men also don't want to engage in this sort of like bro-y masculinity. And this guy would also not fit into those spaces that embody that sort of bro-y masculinity, because neither of us are that. We're just sort of nerdy men. I think that instead, it makes sense to focus the fear that we have of sort of this cis men fear on what's really going on. The scary thing, I think, to many of us is the culture that promotes a type of masculinity that is really unhealthy. It's the culture that tells men that they shouldn't cry or that they shouldn't talk about their feelings, that tells men that they need to be in charge, or that it's inappropriate for men to stay home and take care of kids, that tells men that it's bad to be queer, that tells men that they need to be in positions of power and that they are superior to women. That sort of culture, that undercurrent of sort of that pushes men towards bad behavior, is something to be afraid of. And that is something that will affect trans men. When you start passing as male, you encounter that like literally all the time. I was waiting in line for the bathroom recently, and it was so bizarre. It was like there were two single stalls, two single bathrooms. One was labeled for men, one was labeled for women. Silly, right? And it happened that there were two men waiting for the male bathroom, and there was one woman waiting for the female bathroom. The guy I was waiting with was like, wow, it's crazy there are more men waiting than women because men are just better at the bathroom, right? Like, I'm all for lady power, but like, women are always so bad and slow in the bathroom. It's like, and he like points to me, he's like, we could go out there and like pee in the in the parking lot, but you can't do that to the women. We're just so good at the bathroom. Insane. I was like, I'm just waiting to pee. And you encounter that sort of crazy behavior of men that just assume insane things and feel comfortable saying insane things in public. And yeah, those cultural forces of course influence us, and there's something that we have to like resist, right? But that's what we should be afraid of, is the cultural forces, not the idea of men as people, but the idea of sort of toxic masculinity that is promoted in society. So be afraid of the bad cultural forces, but don't be afraid of people. Many men are awesome, and many men are actively fighting against those sort of stereotypes and those sort of bad forces, just in the way that you will have to fight against those stereotypes and bad forces when you're living as a man. I think that many trans men come into that with a very intense vigor, right? Like, we know what it was to live as women. Some of us, many of us, maybe not all of us, but many of us know what it was like to live as women, and so we're like, never want to do that to a woman, right? We never want to be misogynist, and so we really actively resist it. But there are all sorts of cis men that also come from a place where they also really want to actively resist that kind of harmful behavior. Maybe it's because of the women that raised them really well in life. Maybe it's because they're very kind. Maybe it's because they grew up low income and they know what it's like to have like wrong things assumed about you. There are all sorts of reasons why men sort of really don't want to become bad men. And trans men have one reason, but we don't have the only reason. We are not the only type of good men. There are all sorts of types of good men. And so I won't deny that our transness allows us a unique perspective and a unique kind of care. and that there are certain ways, and say, especially when considering trans violence, yeah, cis men tend to be perpetrators of trans violence in a way that trans men aren't. But we as trans men do have to resist these bad cultural forces that make men behave poorly. And so be afraid of that, and listen and reflect on that in yourself, but don't be afraid of individual men. Because if you're not sort of thinking about those broad cultural forces, and if you're thinking you can just separate yourself from cis men, I think that puts up a blind spot, and you might not even realize the sort of social pressures that are coming at you if you think that you're immune to being perceived in the same way that cis men are perceived. Because once you pass, there's not really that much of a distinction between us and cis men. People see me on the street, and they don't see me as a trans man, they just see me as a man. It's just one type of man, and I just get the same treatment as cis men. And not everyone experiences that, but many of us will. And many of us are going to, again, have to resist sort of the force towards misogyny that our culture pushes towards. And I think the other thing is that with this notion of, like, really good, kind-hearted men, so think about the values that you have. Think about what interests you have, what hobbies you have, what defines you. So I guess two traits that I think really define me are that, so I'm an extroverted grad student, and I am sort of gay and chaotic. And there are so many men, cis and trans, who are extroverted grad students and who are gay and chaotic. I started to feel immensely comfortable in my manhood when I started hanging out with the kinds of men that were like me. It's kind of intuitive when you say it like that, but like, before I transitioned, I had mostly female friends. I lived in a dorm with like 6 other women. I lived with women for years because I also went to boarding school. So I spent 6 years living with women. And I existed in all sorts of women's spaces. I spent a lot of time not with men. I had one-off friendships with men, but I'd never been in like a mostly male group before I transitioned. And so the idea of what it would be to be a man was like kind of foreign to me because I wasn't interacting with that many men. And then I transitioned, and now I spend a lot of my time in social groups that are predominantly male. And that's when I started to really feel comfortable being a man. It's like, I look around me and I see men who are like me, so of course I'm a man. I'm a man in the same way that they're men. And so for me, it's like, okay, I hang out with all sorts of other econ PhDs, and we, play One Night Werewolf, and Catan, and all sorts of board games, and that sort of thing, and we talk about, gossip about our department, and hang out. And then I hang out with other gay men, and, we'll watch Drag Race, we'll go to gay clubs, we'll drink together, and, share stories. And I have so many spaces like that I feel very comfortable in, and it becomes clear to me that it's like, okay, I'm just not that different than these people. It feels like so impossible, the idea of me making a barrier between me and cis men, because I just don't have that barrier. I just hang out with a lot of cis men, so I don't think of myself as that different than them, because I'm not really. And, I'll talk about my transness, it's fun, it's a fun story, and some of my friends are also trans men who hang out with, me in these spaces, and so yeah, like, we are trans, we have stories related to being trans, we have experiences that are defined by our transness and all that, but it's just not that big of a deal at the end of the day when you've fully transitioned. I think that brings me to sort of my final point, which is that a lot of this experience of feeling really comfortable being a man is mostly, like, it mostly ended up achievable for me when I started really passing as male. And it took some time. Like, I started passing as male, and then maybe months later, I eventually felt really comfortable with the fact that I was a man. But it wasn't something that I could have achieved really early in my transition. It took me some time. And so that's something that I think can sound really discouraging, right? It's hard when you have this feeling like you really want to be a man, you want to feel comfortable being a man, but maybe it won't happen for you yet. And maybe it will, right? Like, I think there are lots of people who don't pass fully but still end up really integrated and living as men, and who have all sorts of different experiences from me. But maybe you're in the position that I was in, and it might be that you're going to start feeling comfortable when you pass. And the way that I think of framing this as something that's really awesome and can be very positive is that a lot of us mourn the fact that we didn't have a boyhood, right? We just entered the world as 20-something, 30-something, 40-something men, right? Like, we didn't get to be 12. And I think of this as sort of the trans boyhood. The trans boyhood is the chunk of time where, you're seen sort of visibly as not really a woman. Maybe you're seen sort of androgynous or gender nonconforming, maybe you're seen as a boy, you're seen as something masculine, but not quite a man, or maybe you're seen as a man, but you're not really comfortable with it. It's that stage where you're something male, but not yet really living as a man. And I think that's pretty cool that we get our own trans boyhood. That first year or two of my transition, I was doing all the same sort of silly boy things of trying on different types of clothes to feel like what felt right, what version of man did I want to be. I was trying out different sorts of spaces. It was all new, it was exciting. I was going through the early stages of puberty, right? I was living a sort of trans boyhood. And then eventually I became a man. And I think that that framing can be really useful because I think to me it justifies why many of us don't feel comfortable as men at first. It's not that, it's not that you're crazy and it's not that you never will. It's that you're right now in your boyhood part, right? And it's something that will change over time. Like cis boys, we go from boys to men. And eventually, I think for many of us, feeling comfortable as a man is something that's achievable. And so that's where I think that this framing is more useful, right? Instead of thinking about trans men and cis men as sort of fundamentally different, to say that, no, it's just a matter of time. So maybe for some chunk of time, you do feel that gap between yourself and cis men. But that gap is defined just by time. It's not by something fundamental. For many of us, it's super achievable that we'll find the kinds of spaces where men hang out that are our kind of men and that see us as us. And that actually, socially, maybe it will feel way better. That was the case for me. I think I would have never guessed how much I would enjoy hanging out with other men and how correct that would feel. Because all I had ever done my whole life was really hang out with women. So how could I have possibly known how great it would feel to live and be seen as a man and hang out with other men who are just like me? I couldn't have known it. It wasn't something that I could have done until I did it. But I think it's cool to keep an open mind about the kinds of men you'll find and to remember that those sort of really negative societal forces that make some men behave badly, they'll affect us too, and they won't cause all men to ultimately make bad choices. That many of us, when presented with these negative societal forces, choose to be good men. And that you too can choose to be a good man when you've reached that place in your transition.